Good evening, everyone. Most of you are on mute, so if you say anything back, I won't be able to hear you right now. That's okay. I'll give you a quick introduction, and then when we get to reading, you can unmute yourselves as you read or want to answer questions. So it just occurred to me that we're going through a lot at this time, both as a community, as a Sangha, and as a nation. Our nation is becoming more polarized. The difference between the rich and the poor is growing. In addition to kind of the usual politics, now we have the coronavirus, which is kind of putting everyone under quarantine, and that's a worldwide crisis, not just in the US. So we're going through some hard times, practicing through hard times, not even able to meet, in our usual place in the Sangha. So I'm really excited actually to see so many of you joining on Zoom tonight. And what occurred to me is that a lot of really deep practice happens during dark times or hard times because it's an opportunity for us to really seek deeper answers, to go beyond the surface and search for clarity. And our natural compassion makes us want to make a difference. So if you think about Thich Nhat Hanh, a great Buddhist teacher, he basically developed his practice during the Vietnam War, and he came over to the US to ask the US to please stop bombing his country. And he thought things here would be great because we're not getting bombs dropped on us. And then he found, oh, there's a lot of suffering in the United States as well. And if you go further back in time, there's Suzuki Roshi, who really developed his practice through World War II. And so for some reason, as we were kind of going through these difficult times, I started having memories of Suzuki Roshi practicing at Rinzo Inn in Japan during World War II. And I just remembered like hardship and food shortages and bombs going off and him trying to run the temple throughout all that. And most of you know Suzuki Roshi is actually our founder of our temple, Kenindo, our teacher's teacher. So he's basically our grandfather. And so this is him right here, Suzuki Roshi. And I was reminded of this book that I had read many years ago, which is it's a biography of Suzuki Roshi called Crooked Cucumber. That was his teacher's nickname for him. He called him Crooked Cucumber, by David Chadwick. And I read it many years ago, but as you can see, I have all these little tabs. So I really love this book. And so I recently went back to find the sections that I could remember about him practicing during wartime, and I reread them and I thought, oh, there's some valuable lessons. So if we ever feel really challenged as a community or even as an individual practicing in these times, he kind of gives us a good example for how to practice throughout frustration, confusion, grief, a lot of things. So I haven't timed this. It's a lot of material. So there's a good chance that we'll go over time, or not over time, but that we won't finish the whole thing. We'll probably wrap up around 9 o'clock in about an hour. So there's a chance that we might continue this discussion next week. Having said that, I'm going to go ahead and share what I put together. And actually, before we start, well, let's see, maybe I can do both. Right now I can see everyone. And I'm going to see, okay, this is not what I want, sorry. This one, yes. So you can all see, can you all see the book here? Mm-hmm. Everyone able to see it? Okay, yeah. Great. Because I think there's different views, and one is, I really like the gallery view for seeing everybody during this discussion, but then you probably want to see like the presenter view or whatever, make sure you can have it big enough that someone can actually read. So how this is going to go is we're starting in chapter 6 of wartime, and then we're going to go to just the beginning of chapter 7, which we might not get to until next week. We'll see. And the setting is World War II Japan, so it's 1940 to 1945. I mean, World War II actually started a little earlier, but in the 1930s. But this is the section that is Suzuki Roshi's life during this time. And so the sections are marked like this, and one person will just read the section, They're quite long. Some of them are multiple pages long, but you'll read all of like one color. So the first person will read this as well as these, and then we'll get into the questions for the section. So whoever can actually see and thinks they're going to be able to read, does anyone want to volunteer to start reading? Let me see if I can make it a little bit bigger. There we go. I think that helps. Okay. So I can't see everyone while I have this loaded. So does anyone want to start reading that they feel like they can actually see well enough to read?
I can start. This is Doug.
Hi, Doug. Thanks, Doug. Yeah, go ahead.
So the top of the page.
Yeah.
Okay. In this precarious political climate, Shenryu felt compelled to help his society as best he could. Most people didn't want to think about what was happening, but he had a special rapport with young people whose minds were more open. Even before the war, I had strong feelings against war. I organized young men in my area to have the right understanding of the situation in Japan at that time. We invited good people from the government to come and answer our questions. My focus was not so much on preventing war as on trying to counter one-sided views of Japan's situation, of ourselves, and of human nature. I didn't have any big purpose for my group. I just didn't want my friends to be involved in the kind of nationalism which I thought might destroy Japan completely. It's more dangerous than war. Shenryu met primarily with educated young men of 18 and 19, men who would enter the military when they were 20. Teachers, artists, intellectuals, and others would also come by to talk discreetly and express their views. Sometimes Shenryu handed out papers he'd written, urging that Japan work with other nations toward amicably solving problems rather than acting rationally in a way that might bring on destruction. In his understated, low-key way, he questioned some of the absurd yet popular assumptions and false accusations of the right, and he encouraged a balanced view. Liberal politicians and teachers were being purged and assassinated, but a priest could couch his views within Buddhism's traditional pacifism and dialectic. Shenryu was blessed with a lack of didactism and ideology, which protected him from criticism by right-wingers, but not completely. Some people in the town had been uncomfortable with the goings-on at the temple. Shenryu was occasionally criticized for misleading people, but his way of expressing himself was accepted by his superiors in the Soto organization, and they invited him to head a new organization to promote patriotic imperial Buddhism. He felt they wanted to use his skills to help organize civilians against America and England. He was put on the spot. Japan was supposed to be like one big family built around national identity.
Oh, sorry. Let me get this scrolled over here. And adherence.
Adherence to duty without regard for oneself. It would be unpatriotic to decline. Shenryu thought about how to deal with the offer and decided on a course of action. He accepted. His sponsors were happy. There was a celebratory dinner party, and the next day he resigned. The subtle distinction between refusing and resigning made all the difference. When he returned to Rinzo Inn, neither he nor the temple had lost face.
We'll skip the next paragraph.
Okay. There was a service at Rinzo Inn one Monday morning with just his family in attendance for Buddha's Enlightenment Day, the most important day in the Zen Buddhist year. There had been a big ceremony the day before and a banquet with hundreds in attendance, but Monday was the actual date. 6-year-old Yazuko offered aduki beans and sweet rice soup to Shakyamuni at the family altar and listened to her father and mother chant, the latter holding on to 2-year-old Hoitsu. After the service, Shenryu told his family that a war with the Americans and the English had started. It was December 8th, 1941, still December 7th in the West. In the name of the emperor and with his full knowledge, the Japanese military had struck in Hawaii, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines on the morning of Buddha's enlightenment. What a day to have chosen to launch this insanity. There was nothing Shenryu could do now but recite a sutra.
Thanks, Doug. All right. So then the questions for this section, and I'll just read them all at once so that you can think about them and respond to any and all of them. It's, what position did Shunryu Suzuki Roshi have regarding World War II? And what could have happened to Suzuki Roshi if he had openly expressed his views? And then how did he choose to handle the situation? So we'll stop sharing so anyone can, you can feel free to come to Gasho or just unmute yourself if you want to. Hi, I think I see, I think it's Eleonora. I think you're on mute. Let me unmute you. Here, let me unmute. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, his position was obviously pacifism.
Mm-hmm.
And if he openly spoke out. And the third question was how he did it very subtle way, you know, so he accepted and then resigned rather than, so it was very subtle.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my view.
I think you cut out a little bit on the second question, but if anyone else wants to answer, like, did anyone else catch what would have happened if he openly expressed the war or openly opposed the war?
Prison.
Well, he was opposed to the war, but he did it very subtle.
Yeah. So if he had been very overt and taken a strong stand against it, then what would have happened instead of being subtle?
I think he would be killed. I think they would kill him.
Right. Oh, I see Dave has his hands up. Let me find you to unmute you, Dave.
I'm unmuted, I think.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, I've found reading this chapter to be very thought-provoking because, you know, there's this old saying that history is written by the winners.
Mm-hmm.
We tend to have a very one-dimensional view. Having won the war, we have this one-dimensional view of Japan. And to see this view of it from the inside, and not just from a random person, but from Suzuki Roshi's point of view,
Yeah.
I think, I mean, it sort of gets back to what he said about not having a one-sided view of things, you know, and this helps us gain some perspective. And I mean, it certainly seems true that Suzuki Roshi was opposed to war. He says that very explicitly. But he also was not anti-Japanese by any stretch of the imagination. And so he obviously must have felt very conflicted about, on the one hand, his love of his country, and on the other hand, his distaste for what was happening to his country and what his country was doing in the area around China and so in Nigeria and so forth. But I was particularly struck by this whole thing where he says he wasn't so much against the war as he was against the one-sided view of nationalism. In another one of Suzuki Roshi's lectures, he uses an interesting Japanese phrase. It's called tambanku. And what it basically means is a one-sided view. It means you can only see one thing. It literally comes from the idea of somebody carrying a board on one shoulder so that they can only see on one side but not the other. And he talks about how harmful it is to have such a one-sided view. So I think it really is very interesting for us to have the opportunity to see what was going on for Suzuki Roshi. And you know, he wasn't just very tranquil through all of this. It talks later about the tremendous rage that he flew into after the surrender was announced. And he was clearly bottling up a lot of very complicated feelings. So anyway, I just think that it's very interesting the way he talks about the one-sided view, and in particular how that was so important in the context of World War II.
Yeah, good points, Dave. And I think the point about he deeply loved Japan. He loved Japan very deeply, and yet he hated what Japan was doing at the same time. And it talks about that inner conflict inside even more. Any other comments on this section? While you're thinking about it, I'm going to go back and share that section a little bit more. I'll scroll back up to the part we read right here. So they kind of give you the answer here. Liberal politicians and teachers were being purged and assassinated. So it really was, he could have lost his life if he had been more vocal, just say. So, and then there's this one quote by Suzuki Roshi: "The way that helps will not be the same. It changes according to the situation." Okay, any more thoughts on this section before we move to the next section? All right, can I have a volunteer to read section 2? Whoever has good eyes.
I'll do it, Dan Geiger.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
There were few people in Japan those days who thought the war was wrong, and few of those had figured out how to talk about it without going to jail or losing their positions. No one could voice strong doubts or criticize the state, but there was room for positive suggestions. Anything Shunryu had done that could be considered remotely anti-war, he had done before the Pacific War started. Now, in 1943, there was little he could do. He didn't oppose the war, didn't oppose the government, didn't advocate surrender, didn't say that Japan was wrong. He didn't want Japan to lose the war. He just wanted it to be over. He was torn between his belief in Buddhism and peace and his devotion to duty and country. But if he was careful, he could talk about how much more Japan could accomplish if there were peace. The official policy of the government was that the war was being fought for peace, so students could talk about the root cause of war and risking their lives for peace. It would be difficult to say that the war should be ended right away, but so many had already died in the fighting, and people were living in such hardship that it was a patriotic duty to suggest ways that Japan could become strong and healthy as a nation again. Shunryu never overtly invoked the precept against killing to advocate an end to the war on moral grounds. With so many males at war, it was unusual to see all those young men going in and out of Rinsoin. People noticed, but the boys seemed to be upstanding citizens. When their time came to enter the military, they bid farewell to their comrades and went off. In 1941, all Japanese men had been required to take a physical exam, and all were subject to the draft, including Buddhist priests. If they refused, they would go to jail. And after being drafted, they would be treated as priests, again, only when they died or returned home. Men over 40 or those who failed the physical would be sent to factories or left to work in the fields. Shunryu had escaped the draft. Some said it was because he was too small, because of his persistent cough from having had tuberculosis. Others thought it was because he had influential friends, such as the eccentric Kozokato, a former member of the Diet's lower house. Shunryu himself thought he had escaped military duty because the authorities feared that his unusual ideas would hurt morale and decided to keep him marginalized in his temple, where he seemed to be doing no harm. My name had a mark by it. I can't read anymore.
My name had a mark by it, he said.
He said, yes. Oh, that's it. Yeah.
And then there's one more. Well, actually, it just goes on. Well, actually, since this is a long section, any thoughts just on that section so far? Okay.
Well, it's a long period of time, isn't it? From 1940 to 43, and you sort of overlook a lot of, there's a lot implied in what's going on there about sort of internal conflict he was going through.
Mm-hmm.
And having to live sort of in two worlds, maybe three worlds, I'm not sure. His own world, his world with his colleagues and who he was with, and then the world of the war itself. So he must have been very conflicted. That's my feeling.
Yeah. And I just imagine that, like, being a priest and then getting drafted for a war, right?
Yeah.
And that you're expected to go kill and set aside all the religious precepts that was, previously before. Like, I mean, that could happen in this country too, not that it will, not putting that out there, but what a challenge to actually be expected to go kill as part of duty and try to have a spiritual life. Actually, right now, I want to acknowledge Dave Riddell, who's on the call right now, because I remember you mentioned that just in your work, you had to change your job because you felt that, they started to build weapons and things, or things that you were not comfortable with. And so, that's, I think, a challenge is the right livelihood, right, that we all face. And I think that I've seen several people in Silicon Valley sometimes having to face, like, is my job, what I'm making a living on, actually helping humanity or not?
Yes. Yeah, there's a famous old saying that there's nothing so difficult as getting somebody to understand something when they're making a living depends on not understanding it.
Yeah, that's good.
It's a good one.
All right, well, since this is a long section, does anyone else want to pick up this section? Oh, I'm getting a chat.
I can read. I think, am I unmuted?
Yeah, you're unmuted. We can hear you. Go ahead, Brenda.
Okay. Some communists were going to jail for not supporting the war effort, but no Buddhists took that strong a stand. Soldiers and naval engineers, can you move it over a little bit to the left, the text?
Yes.
Soldiers and naval engineers took over the far wing of Rinzo Inn and eventually even part of the family quarters as their residence. A communication station was being built on the mountain and an airfield was under construction in the city. The military needed the spacious temple to house the overflow of personnel. Shunryu and Chie did not like having soldiers in the temple. They were coarse, arrogant, and rude, and they would not make themselves useful in any way. It was almost unbearable to have to listen to their merrymaking late into the night. While distressed at the attitude of these guests who had been forced on the temple, Shunryu and his students had to suffer it in silence. The soldiers would take food from the temple and make unreasonable demands on his and Chie's time. Officers would strike underlings. The army used a stick, the navy a strap. Their presence made Chie and Shunryu value the young men from the high grass mountain group all the more. Some soldiers came to Shunryu for advice and sat zazen with him. He treated them with the same respect as he would a monk. Can you move it up a bit?
Yeah.
He was ready to respect soldiers if they were sincere, but he found that most were not. It was most painful when the authorities informed him that they would also house Korean laborers at Rinzo Inn. These were men who had been yanked from their homeland and who were now forced to work for their captors. The Koreans moved into the zendo, which Shunryu had been fixing up for his students to sit in. And then there was the day they had to give the temple bells to the Navy to be melted down for ship propellers. This was heartbreaking for Shunryu. He especially loved the big old bell. Its sound would carry far away into Yaizu and was part of the soul of Rinzo Inn. But all metal belonged to the war effort. Families gave the metal in their homes, women gave their rings. So on the appointed day, Shunryu helped the old men in the congregation gather the bells and gongs. They lowered the large bronze bell from its tower. decorated it, and tied it to timbers with rope. In front of the temple, in fancy robes, he conducted a service to send these sacred instruments to war. The men hoisted the timbers onto their shoulders, and the procession went off to the docks to deliver Buddha's gift and their sacrifice at an official military reception. Shunryu refused to join them and went to his room to be alone.
Wow. Can you imagine? I mean, some of these sacred bells take many, many months to make. And they are made with ceremony, and they have a beautiful sound with so much craftsmanship. And imagine that sacred piece instrument being melted down to make a ship propeller, right? I mean, it's crazy. So, all right, let me zoom out a little bit. So the questions for this section are, the Suzuki's and Rinso-in temple faced tremendous hardship during the war, having to house rude soldiers and prisoners of war, experiencing food shortages, and having to give away the sacred bells to be melted to make ship propellers. So what must Suzuki Roshi have been feeling during this hard time, and how did he continue to practice during this time? And hi, Teresa. Thanks for joining us. Teresa just joined. Okay.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for organizing, Bonnie.
Oh, what time is it in Spain?
It's 4:30 almost.
Oh, wow. That's nice and early.
Wow.
That's commitment.
No, you know, I'm used to get up at this time.
That's true.
Wonderful. Hi, Teresa.
Hi.
Yeah, good to hear you, Teresa. Glad you're well.
Yes, you too. Nice to see you all.
Teresa, are you still coming back in March or no?
No, I was actually scheduled to fly tomorrow, but my flight was canceled.
Yeah, a lot of international flights are being canceled right now, so.
Just indefinitely, or
Sorry?
in like no indefinitely, like
We don't know. I don't think.
Yeah, I don't know. I have to wait and see how the situation evolves. You know, it's pretty bad around here right now. I think it's the 4th country with the most cases, and they're closing the airports, the borders. So I'll have to wait for a few more weeks, see if things calm down, and then buy my ticket again. They offered the option to rebook it, but I didn't do that because, you know, I don't know what's going to happen.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense. I think nobody really knows yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that things over there are getting also pretty intense in the Bay Area.
Yeah, we're on lockdown right now, but great time for video conferencing.
Yeah.
Talk about Suzuki Roshi during the war.
Yeah, so any thoughts on, I mean, it's kind of straightforward. I mean, he went to his room to be alone. I mean, but like, how do you think he continued his practice during like this time where there's so much upheaval and chaos?
It seems like he could just continued very simply. Like he just didn't make any assumptions. He didn't go out, you know, making any claims. He just continued his practice, and whoever came, he was open to it, and you know, even the soldiers who would come sit, he would allow them to come and sit and treat them like everybody else.
Yeah, that's a good point. So as annoying as it was and frustrating having these kind of brutal soldiers, having to house them and feed them while they're being disrespectful, but every once in a while there'd be like 1 or 2 that would be like, hey, what's this meditation practice? And he would actually let them sit and teach them like they were Zen students, like they were monks. And I mean, and then they're carrying that into the battlefield with them. Like, that's pretty powerful.
Yes, he was very mellow, but you know, that's also, one can say that's a method of survival. The similar situation was when Nazi, for example, invaded Europe, and in Europe, not everybody could evacuate. And so many people lived with Nazi. Nazi would just come to their apartments. And so if you wanted to survive, you had to just be nice to them. That's just the way of, you know.
You didn't have much of a choice. Yeah.
Exactly. They come and they say, we're going to live in your house. And if they were, for example, in the countryside, in the village, of course, they could say, okay, give me your chicken, right? But they could ask anything. But if it was in the countryside, they say, well, kill your chicken and give it to us, right? So the people who lived, that's what they had to do. So in this case, Suzuki Roshi was just doing what he wanted.
You're breaking up a little bit, Eleonora.
I said so. Suzuki Roshi was doing the same way, I guess. You know, if you want to survive, then you have to be nice.
Yeah. Yeah, so he was doing whatever he had to do. But there was this passage back on page 94 that we read in the earlier section when they first started attacking, Hawaii, Hong Kong, Malaysia on the day of Buddha's enlightenment. And it said, there was nothing Shinryo could do now but recite a sutra. So it was like you said, Brenda, he looked for just the very small, simple things he could do that were positive, like really small, simple things. Yeah.
So thinking back to what we were talking about previously of how do you carry out your vows as a priest on the battlefield, and I can't really wrap my head around that, but how do you carry out your vows to save all beings as a Buddhist? And at least Suzuki Roshi could do that and meet every person and come back to his practice in those little ways in each moment. And it sounds like he did that. He met every experience, like Brenda was saying, with beginner's mind. And he was able to live out his vows in the situation he was put in.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on this section before we go to the next section?
I think it's unusual, though, that he didn't have to go. In a way, he was lucky. It's how many people had that opportunity for whatever reason.
You know, I was thinking as I was reading this passage of, something Les has said in the past, which is that everybody who met Suzuki Roshi remembered meeting Suzuki Roshi. Like there was always, like years later, they would say, I remember when I met Suzuki Roshi, that there was something special about him. And I wonder if they, when they came to interview him, they brought him to like, we don't want to mess with this guy. He's just a little, let's leave him be.
The answer is kind of in the book, because who would know better why he got left out of the war than Suzuki Roshi himself, right? So there was all this speculation, it's because he was too small. It was because he had a little cough from when he had tuberculosis. There's all this speculation about why didn't Suzuki Roshi get drafted? And his answer, Suzuki Roshi's answer is, they knew my ideas were a little different and they didn't want me causing any problems for the war. And so they chose to keep me marginalized in my temple, where they thought, well, he won't cause any major disruption there. So, I mean, it would have been interesting. What if he had been put on the battlefield? Would he have walked off the field and other people might have followed him? Would he have just surrendered and got himself killed and, rather than fight? I mean, it's very hard. Would he have started speaking out against it? So I think that even though he was very, very subtle, they knew that he was not 100% aligned with this program, and they didn't really want anyone with a dissenting viewpoint actually in the mix, So that's why Suzuki Roshi himself felt that they didn't draft him.
But he also, this is May, but Suzuki seems a very, has this unusual capability about being detached. I mean, either emotion, because such a strong emotion, and also rationale is also, I think at that time it's you're against the wall, and then so he seems to always manage himself to be detached, whatever situation, and he seems to always maintain a a certain temperature. You know what I mean? It's kind of like emotion or rational, whatever his mind or his emotion. He seems to be able to. I'm not sure how he control himself, and then he seems always contained, you know, and then such that his emotion or even word, right, and doesn't come out as very destructive, and he just have this unusual capability. And plus, you know, and then the people who is for the war must like him to, you know, I don't know what it is. And this person is remarkable. I mean, he is a riding on the fine line, almost like he always working on the double-edged sword, right? He's on this thin line, and he just didn't fall. So he didn't fall on either side. And then but this own path is I just can imagine. I think in his time might be very, very thin, very, very narrow, but he managed to be able to maintain the stability and balance. I mean, just extraordinary.
Yeah,
I don't know how to describe this person. It just
me.
Yeah.
I think the word that you're describing is composure. You know how Les would always say, if we practice.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Even Suzuki Roshi has put in certain writings, like even when we die, we can have perfect composure. So while we have all these emotions and anger and all these things coming up, the practice is, oh yes, these are all my emotions. Let me set that aside and do what needs to be done. Recite a sutra or take down the bell. What do I have to do right now? And be very composed. And you bring up another point, which is everyone that talks about Suzuki Roshi, everyone liked him. You know,
that's magic.
Not to like him. So I think it also makes me wonder how many people just really respected him for somehow finding a way to stay true to himself despite all of this, and how many people kind of, even though they were soldiers and had to go fight, kind of really wish that they could be as brave as Suzuki Roshi.
Yeah, I think here's my theory. I think he touched some universal frequency, but he's also able to tune to individual frequency because everybody is vibrating different situation, and he's able to both empathy and also be I'm not sure he vibrate at the same rhythm as individual people, but the other side might fail, right? He's there, and then people like him, and then that's really amazing.
You know, I think it's important what May was saying about Suzuki Roshi's ability to control his emotions or contain himself and everything. I think we have to be careful not to idealize him, though, as some sort of super figure who could maintain perfect composure in the face of all of these things. And I was really struck by that description of the scene after the emperor's speech, basically, giving up on the war, and how ferocious he was in expressing his emotions toward the soldiers who were being so sort of disrespectful of the country and the emperor and the whole situation. That he was just went into a complete, meltdown, basically. I mean, he was obviously, a very great teacher and great Zen master, but he was human. And it seems pretty clear that an awful lot of what was going on in terms of effectively maintaining his composure had to do with bottling up a lot of his feelings about the situation too. So it must have been incredibly difficult for him.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm talking about. Is he's able to, I mean, he's just like a water. He just flow, and when the outside is high, he's high, and then he sync with that situation. And in the meantime, he also have composure. So that would like just, he can basically. I think Buddha definitely have many different I mean, manifest in many different ways, and he simply be able to do that, including anger, by the way, including show some strong emotions. That's also part of the Buddha. But composure is part of the Buddha, but maybe it's not. Maybe it just shows strong emotions, also part of the Buddha.
Yeah, he was definitely very human. He had moments like just wanting to be alone, shows some sadness about that, moments of anger. He made some mistakes as well, mistakes in judgment, which there's a tragedy regarding his first wife, Chie, which if you read the whole book, you'll find out he really went through a major tragedy, which he must have carried a lot of guilt after that. So he was human and he had flaws, but you also can see the sincerity of his practice and how dedicated he was to doing his best to do the right thing, right? Any other comments on this section before we go to the next section?
I was kind of surprised at what clearly were incredibly strong emotions that he was going through the entire time. I would have expected a person like that to be kind of trying to figure out how to detach, how to get rid of attachments, it's just a bell, well, part of the same thing, just giving it up, whatever. I would have expected a more philosophical, detached attitude than what he expressed.
Yeah, and you see that shows us that the practice is not really about, sometimes when we think of non-attachment, people misinterpret that as not caring. But really what it is the practice is to deeply, deeply care, but to be able to set it aside enough to see clearly, like not one-sided view. So I thought it was actually beautiful and sad, but what he did for the bells, because he couldn't keep them, you had to hand it over to the military. But he did a ceremony. He dressed them up and said a good farewell and honored the bells as they're on their way out. I mean, he did what he could to honor everything, right? And I mean, that's kind of sweet, even though then they're going to go be melted down, but they had a good send off, it's very moving. All right. So I guess we will continue with the next section. Okay, so we're skipping these pages. If you have on your own time, you can read that. But the summary of what has just happened is, in the middle of the war between Japan, China, and the US, Suzuki Roshi has agreed to escort the son of a good friend from Japan to Manchuria, China. This is in the middle of a war with China. So the boy will not have to travel alone. And the journey is perilous. And after staying for some time, they urgently need to return to Japan. And this is their return journey. So let me zoom in a bit. And I could use a volunteer, whoever wants to read, starting from now Shunryu.
Well, he tried to, it was a little more than that, because he tried to set up a temple in Japan, right, in Manchuria.
There was a lot more that happened. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
He was
yeah, they were thinking about staying there for longer and doing other things. So there was more that happened. Do you have any comments on that part, Brenda, on the part that we glossed over?
I do. There was a cute little quote in there about the tigers, that there may be tigers in Manchuria. And he says something like, and I can't remember the exact quote, but it's like, tigers, that's great. He said, if a Zen person, they can't deal with tigers, then they're not worth their salt. Something like that. I love that quote.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, definitely there's a lot of courage there. Yeah. That's funny. Yeah, I think actually, so how what I remember from that section is actually his friend Kozo, the one with the kind of different ideas. They were in some ways trying to, he had friends that were in some ways trying to stop the war by going to China and talking to the Emperor of China and like doing things. So I don't remember all of the political ins and outs, but I remember that he was basically agreeing to escort his friend's son. So his friend being this kind of political figure, and he doesn't want the boy to travel by himself during this war thing. So, but yeah, there was a lot more, and they were thinking about setting a temple there. And but then something changed, and war breaks out, and they need to flee back to Japan. So that's the state that they're in right now.
Yeah, there's a lot, there's a long history with Manchuria in Japan, because, you mentioned like how a lot of the people who would be resisting the war, they would actually get sent to Manchuria, and they would get put on the front lines. So the pacifists, because I had an acupuncture teacher who this happened to. Wow. So he was actually out protesting the war, and he was a pacifist, and then they just take him and they put him right in the front lines to get, run over and shot at as the first few rounds of people with, they don't carry weapons. So they're just kind of sitting ducks. And he became blinded by grenades, by mines, I guess. And then actually subsequently became an acupuncturist. But so Manchuria has a lot, there was a front, basically, a fighting front right in Manchuria. And so this is where he's going. He's going in towards a war zone.
Yeah, that's really brutal. I mean, wow. So that's if he had spoken out openly and advocated pacifism, he would have been sent to the front lines to actually be murdered. I mean, that's really brutal. It's really horrifying. And, this particular group of Japanese leaders were doing horrible things, as you know, like what happened in Nanking and other places. And I believe Manchuria is no longer even known as Manchuria because of what happened there. It had such a dark history from that time that they actually started calling it something else.
Mongolia, I guess.
Yeah. Wow. Some very intense times. Okay, so who would like to read next? Anyone that can see?
All right, I will read. I will read.
Yes, go ahead, Eleonora.
Okay. Now Shunru and Taro had to get out as quickly as they could, forgetting the temple and the farm. Of the 3 ferries that had been running sporadically between Korea and Japan, only one had not been sunk. Every day, Shunru and Taro would go to the train station only to be told that the boat was not coming in from Busan. Finally, one day tickets were available and the 2 left on the 3:15 p.m. train. At the station in Harbin, they were told that the ferry from Busan had been damaged. Shunru said that there would be a way and they should just continue. They made it to the coast and found a steamboat carrying a cargo of chickens to Korea. Soon he and Taro were steaming south. On the boat were many Koreans in a jubilant mood. They had taken all the good seats and now were pushing the Japanese around, shouting, "You're going to lose the war." The steamboat ride ended in northern Korea, and they went to the train station. A sign read, "We will not sell tickets. There is no boat to Japan." Shunru said not to worry, that they could not depend on signs. To me, the sign reads, "We will sell tickets. There is a boat to Japan." He felt they should just take the train and something would happen. They asked for tickets to Japan, and when told that none were available, Shunru asked for tickets going south along the coast. That's where the boats are. At each station, they would get out, go to the docks, and talk to the workers about how dangerous it was to go to Japan, about the condition of ships, and about where one might be leaving from. Keep going south, they were told. Eventually, at a small station, the conductor announced that all who wanted to go to Japan should get off and go to Sonroshin. When they reached Sonroshin, they were told to go to a nearby Fort Mason at the harbor. No one knew if a boat would come. There was a talk of all the ships that had been sunk. America was in total control of the seas. Finally, one day, a huge Navy troop ship came into the harbor escorted by 2 cruisers. Shunru looked at it and like the sound of a bell ringing in his head, came the certainty that this would be their last chance for a long time. Shunru and Tara watched as troops boarded. Many were wounded and carried on stretchers. A crowd of Japanese civilians was desperately trying to get on board. "We will be on this ship. Just wait here for a while," Shunru told Taro and walked off. He came back with a permission from the captain to board. When darkness fell, they steamed out of the harbor. At 3 in the morning, they anchored far from the shore. Watching the skies and listening to waves, Shunru was reminded of Dogen's perilous journey to China and back in the 13th century, and felt confident that as Dogen survived to bring Nojo's teaching to Japan, so would he survive to sow his Dharma seeds. Morning approached. They learned that Hakata Harbor was considered too dangerous to enter. The ship had anchored outside Onishi, a port that was too small for it to enter. Launches were sent down to take them to the mainland. Shunru and Taro boarded a civilian express train that stopped at Shizuoka. The mood in the station was different from anything they'd felt before, angry and frightened. People were breaking windows to get into the train. They were attacked by the airplanes 3 times on the way back, but the train kept going. On the night of July 15, having been away for 2 months, they arrived at Shizuoka station during an air raid. They both went to Rinzo Inn, where everyone was overjoyed to see them back safely. In Japan, it is customary for a traveler to bring gifts home from a trip, and Shunru surprised his children with a box of Korean hot dog. He and Taro scrubbed themselves down, then took long bath in hot, clean water. Kozo showed up the next day. "It's a miracle. Come back," he exclaimed, crying and hugging his son and Shunru. "How did you make it?" Shunru and Taro looked at each other. "We don't know," Shunru said.
You can stop there, and I'll read this section after we answer the questions. Okay, so let me zoom out so I can see the question. All right, so Suzuki Roshi and Taro travel through bomb raids and sinking ships back to Japan during a time when very few people traveling that path make it to their destination alive. Sorry, I'll zoom out one more. When asked how they miraculously made it home, Suzuki replies, "We don't know." However, throughout the journey, he never once expressed doubt of their ability to make it home. In fact, he seemed sure that they would make it and even knew which ship would take them, despite many signs that it would not. So, how is this possible? Is it possible to know without knowing? And what or who are Suzuki Roshi's Dharma seeds? Those are the questions for this section. So how did he make it back? Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
I don't have answers to those questions, and the story is a little terrifying. But I kept thinking to myself how I kept thinking of Around the World in 80 Days, and what a good traveling companion Suzuki Roshi would be if you were trying to make a world record around the world trip.
Absolutely.
I wonder if he did it to just encourage his companion, you know, just to give him confidence that they will reach their destination.
Right. He was the father in a sense of the
Right.
young man, so he had to be confident.
Mhm.
But in that confidence, he also, in a sense, was, you know, putting his best foot forward and creating the situation that would, he didn't give up. He kept going he didn't wait for some solution to be offered, but he kept moving. He kept trying different things.
Yeah, like, oh, there's no, there's no trains to Japan. Okay, well, let's take a train south because that's where boats are. Maybe boats are going to Japan. He just like kept going, kept going.
What Brenda just said about putting your best foot forward reminds me of a thing that I heard Stephen Batchelor say one time. He said that the way isn't a path from where you started to where you're going to end up. The way tells you how to put one foot in front of the other right where you are right now.
It seemed like his thinking was so clear in the situations that he was faced with compared to everybody else, you know, that people breaking into the trains, being the air raid going in. And it reminds me of Phil Jackson, who's a professional basketball coach, and in one of his books about his practice and how he used to meditate and observe his pulse during the most stressful times in the game. And he talked about how the more stressful the situation, the more successful the practice would be, or the more help the practice would be. And it just kind of reminded me of obviously how stressful a situation he was in there, but maybe his practice was allowing him because it was so stressful, and the more stressful, it was more effective. But he just seemed so clear in his thinking and in his feelings.
Yeah, I agree with that. He was very clear-minded, like, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to get on this train. We're going to go here. Okay, that didn't work. Fine, we're going to go there. It's like he never really he never panicked.
Right.
He had some way to kind of ease through all of that. And I do think that part of it was also wanting to be strong for the younger man and wanting to inspire that confidence. But I think when he was that positive, like you said, Brenda, in a way it opened the door for their best chance to get through. I mean, it's crazy. Like, they were attacked like 3 times by planes and bombs dropping, and then they made it through.
Yeah. The description doesn't reflect any fear, the passage.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I'm thinking about what Brenda just said. In a given situation, in a difficult situation, I wonder if you have any chance to affect the result if you have an optimistic approach to it, like Suzuki had in this case.
Kind of like the placebo effect, right?
Right.
They work, right?
It works.
Law of attraction. You know this theory of law of attraction, right?
It also reminds me a little bit of the current situation.
Sorry, we broke up a little bit, so go ahead. I think Eleonora and then Teresa were both speaking.
Oh, I said this is, what is it, the law of attraction? You know, this theory of law of attraction?
Yeah.
It's basically what vibrate when you think positive into vibrations into universe, and then it responds in kind. Yeah. So I guess that's why he exercised that theory.
I particularly love this because he doesn't have the mind of future, which means he doesn't he didn't worry, and he just do one step at a time, and then he concentrate all his energy on the present moment. And then so because once you don't have anything, you just concentrate. I say concentration. Of course, the underneath is faith, and there's no doubt, absolutely zero. And then he concentrate, and then now it's just tremendous power. So I think once you're in that zone, I think everything just open the door for you. Doesn't matter, honestly. I think he probably, his mind is travel, not in his, by the way, you know, whatever what we learn is whatever we see or whatever, although this is the danger, maybe it's reality, but it's also kind of illusion as well.
And I think it's important not to think of it as optimism. I think it's no fear. And he's seeing things more realistically in a way and taking it one step at a time. But optimism is just adding something. It's probably unneeded, you know, that would be maybe natural for him or not, but it wasn't something that I wouldn't think that optimism was really a play here, my guess.
So what you're saying, Dan, is like, so while optimism is like, okay, the things are going to turn out as best, like, you know, it's all going to work out, kind of Pollyanna-ish, but you're saying this is different. It was more of a subtraction of the negative. Like when you get all the fear out of the way, you can actually see what's present. Like, oh, well, if we go here, then we might be able to go there. Then we might, you know, rather than being caught in the emotions of it. So it's more like people said, like he was actually very present rather than getting caught up in the future and what could happen and I could die. He's like, well, we could go here, we could go there, and it was clear-minded.
Yeah, I think I particularly like this. I think because of the hope and then be joyful, be always optimistic seems to be, you know, of course everybody want that, but there's also a very subtle fear underneath hope. And so I don't see him actually project anything, and then he doesn't have any expectation. So I think optimism might associate with some sort of like very subtle way about expectation, but he doesn't have that. He just doing, just like Bonnie, what you're saying, it's fully present, and at this moment, just all the concentration has been focused on this moment, and then just one step at a time, and then without any expectation, without any mind of future. Just move forward.
Thanks, May.
That's really powerful.
There's a mention at one point in the book about how Suzuki Roshi liked to play Go. And there are two fundamental rules about being a successful Go player. One is that you have to always have a plan, and the other is that you must not get attached to your plan. You must be ready to change your plan at any moment due to changing circumstances. And this passage with the trains and the boats and everything reminds me of that.
Maybe that was his
very well said.
strategy from playing Go.
I think Anna was raising her hands.
Oh, Anna?
I think back to this one little story of Suzuki Roshi often. It's silly, but it was San Francisco Zen Center's first big fundraiser, and Janis Joplin was singing. It was back in the 60s, and Suzuki Roshi had to introduce her, and it was this big crowd, and he turned to someone and he said, "I'm scared," and he squeezed their hand, and then he walked right on stage and he did it in front of everyone. And it's an example of, you know, acknowledging your feeling and then doing it, and moving forward and doing what you need to do. And I think of that with this. And also just, I think he had a right understanding of, you know, life is a gift and we don't know what it's going to be for us. It was possible he wasn't going to go back to Japan, but he clearly really wanted to. And so with each turn, he was trying to be creative about how to make that happen. But he accepted that you don't know what the turns are going to be. So that's what I was thinking with this passage.
Thanks, Anna. Teresa?
Yeah, this situation he was in reminds me of any situation when we are not in control, when things are very fluid, and when I've been in situations like that, you just realize that what Suzuki Roshi also said, that one thing flows into another. There's nothing to grasp. And then what he's showing in this situation, there's nothing to grasp, and he just have what May said, he has faith that things will work out. Mm-hmm. And it reminds me a little bit of what's happening now, that is such a, we're not in control. And then I guess when you're not in control.
Anyone else feeling like I'm
not flow.
Yeah.
You just have to flow with things and have faith that it will work out. And faith, to call it that way, is so powerful, and it's also difficult at the same time to have that true faith.
Yes. That's very well said, too.
You know,
go ahead, Brenda.
Someone else was talking?
No, I was trying to figure out who was talking. Okay, it's Brenda. Go ahead.
Okay. I was just watching TV a little earlier, and I have to say, I'm actually, very deeply impressed by the people of the United States. Not being a totalitarian regime, basically relying on everybody's good faith to stay home. There were these videos of Times Square, and it was absolutely deserted, and people are getting it. Like, people are staying home. And that's, I have to say that that level of understanding and discipline and personal responsibility is really quite impressive. If this is who people are, then we will get through this very well, so
Brenda,
I was very moved.
Brenda.
Yeah, Eleonora?
Brenda, but I don't want to respond to Brenda. You have seen a good example, but I have seen on the news how people on Miami Beach are groups of young people very close to each other, like that fish in a can, dancing, and they're next to each other, no distancing, and there are a lot of them. That's right. On Miami and Miami Beach. One example. Second example from the news yesterday is in San Francisco. They have put portable to wash hands, portable sinks, and they were vandalized. Yeah. So here we have what you have said in New York, and here is what I have seen on television in news Miami, and I have heard about San Francisco. So
yes. This is a human existence. We have free will to do what we want, and then there's consequences, right? So right now, Florida is one of the states, I think, having some serious outbreaks right now.
If you only could see line of them next to each other dancing.
Yeah.
On the beach.
Right. Yeah. Well, and sometimes, some of the younger ones might not experience as much symptoms, right? But then it's challenging because they can be carriers for older populations. So
exactly.
Tough. Yeah, it's a tough situation.
They think they're indestructible. That's the thing. Young people, when they are in their 20s, they feel they really, maybe not everybody, I don't know, but they feel they're indestructible. Nothing is going to happen to them. That's the thing.
And they don't care about anybody else, really. Like, it's not even just them. They're essentially saying they don't care.
Yeah.
Well, part of it might also be lack of awareness, right? The one-sided view. So they might be like, I'm not afraid. I don't care if I get exposed. And yet they don't realize that, well, if they get exposed, they might be affected very little, but then they could infect someone else. And that could have.
Exactly.
So it's probably most likely a lack of awareness, which we all have lacks of awareness. We all have our blind spots. And so, yeah, having patience with our own country and having patience with our own people is part of this practice.
Yeah, and they're saying though that it's not true any longer that this is only dangerous for older people. At least in Spain, there are young people with no previous pathologies who are starting to die too.
Wow.
Wow.
Yeah. And yesterday, also another example I'll give you, which is also very, very bad, also on the news. I'm only telling you what I heard on the news. A mother was with a girl, and the girl was out of school, of course. So the girl, she said, my daughter is in the 2nd grade, and she sounded very annoyed that the school is closed and my daughter is without company, without having anybody to talk to. And then she said, well, but at least people like me, I have a solution. I work as a nanny, so I work with many other children. So I take my daughter there and they will be all playing together.
Yeah. So that's, again,
in San Francisco.
That's a, you know, a not understanding the seriousness of the situation, right? And it's, I mean, I think Suzuki Roshi could relate. I mean, in his case, people were actually going out and killing people. And in our case, they're kind of going out and mingling, not knowing that they're spreading germs. So I think practicing with patience and having patience for people who might be causing harm is something really challenging we have to practice with. I just want to do a time check because it's getting close to 9:10, so we're getting close to wrapping up. But I see Columbine, you have been in Gasho. Yes, please, Columbine.
Yeah, I have a lot to say, but one thing today, I was hiking and I came across the guy and he said, you know, it's not a big deal, I won't die. And I said to him, well, you know, you could infect somebody else and you could tell that it was just registering it. He hadn't thought of that, obviously. But about the optimism, I think that's a really good point. In some ways, I think it is optimism to trust that, you know, because I tend to worry a lot. And as a child, I'd always think about the future and, well, what if this happens? And what if that happens? And my dad would always say, you know, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So basically saying to me, look, you know, these are your decisions now, but you're not going to be able to make the following decision until you know what happens from these. So let's not even worry about it at this point. Let's cross that bridge when we get to it. And I think that that's a really, you know, you can play these things forward so many different ways, you just go crazy. So just taking it a step at a time, and I guess it's optimistic to know that eventually, you know, if you keep going with it, you know, you'll get to the point you need to be. And then there was one other thing. Yeah, I can't remember now, sorry.
No problem. If you remember later, you can. Umar, go ahead. You're on mute. Let me unmute you. Where are you? Unmute. There you go.
So what I was going to say was that, you know, there's a lot of foolishness going on in the world right now. And this is why we practice not to get caught up by all the foolishness that is going on in the world. This is why we sit. This is why we meditate. This is why Suzuki Roshi had composure, because he sat and he knew that he had to do the right thing. And in doing so, what we need to do is we need to take care of ourselves. And this is the most important point, because if we take care of ourselves, if we don't take care of ourselves, we won't be able to take care of each other. And as a Sangha, that is the most important thing to understand. And this is what he understood from all the stuff that we've read tonight. He did not go by all the foolishness that was going on around him. They took away his bell, they took away whatever they could take away from him. He was said, okay, I'm going to go ahead and, you know, keep on my path. And he took care of himself, he took care of other people around him. He didn't engage in any foolishness, and he moved forward. And this is the real lesson that comes out of it. And we cannot just get caught up in all this stuff. There've been long line at Trader Joe's. They've, you know, toilet papers and paper towels have disappeared. You know, but we as human beings can make do. We are extremely resourceful. I don't know if you guys have seen that movie, Captain Phillips, but one of the great lines from that movie is that we are stronger than we think.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what Suzuki Roshi has shown us through this reading and through this whole, you know, 5 or 6 pages that we've gone through tonight. So let's take care of ourselves. Let's take care of each other and not get caught into the foolishness of it all.
Thanks, Omar. Oh, go ahead, Lee.
I also wanted to say something that it reminds me of that improv wisdom of don't overthink things, just show up and be there for what is happening right in this moment. And that's what this journey seems to illustrate to me. He didn't say, oh, well, when we get here, there'll be something there. And if it's not there, then give up. He would just say, okay, we get to this point. Now what can we do to get to the next point? And he just went day by day, trip by trip until he got back home.
Thanks, Lee. Thanks, Umar. So I think, Umar, the main point that I think you brought up is that practice is more important during hard times. Like when the world is going crazy and things are chaotic, then practice is actually even more important then. It's not just something we do when everything's balanced and, you know, I'm all caught up on work. It's like, no, when things get really crazy, that's when we need to sit and see clearly and, you know, take really good care of our lives and ourselves and others. So thank you both for those points. Great. So we're at 9:13. I'm going to quickly go back. There was one short paragraph left of this section that Suzuki Roshi's words himself. And we will continue next week as well because there's a couple sections left. They're shorter ones, so I think next week will be a little shorter. But let me go back so we can finish up this section. And one of the questions will stay for you to ponder with, which is the Dharma seeds. So let me zoom in. So several of you mentioned faith or optimism. You had different words for it, or seeing clearly. But notice what he said, that Shinru was reminded of Dogen's perilous journey to China, right? So he felt confident that as Dogen survived to bring Nyojo's teaching to Japan, so he would survive to sow his Dharma seeds. So one question you can think about is, what are Suzuki Roshi's Dharma seeds that he was so determined to sow, that he felt that I have to stay alive and come back so that this will happen? And then this is the last paragraph of this section. So can I have a volunteer to read this paragraph, starting with as long? Here, let me zoom in a little bit more.
I can read.
Okay, give me a second. All right. Okay, go ahead, Teresa. That was Teresa, right?
Yeah. But I don't see the last the right corner. The first word on the last word on the first line. Assuring.
Oh,
a little bit more to the left.
Okay, it's because, okay, sorry, whenever these words are a little bit blurry, it's because I have my Post-it notes, my clear sticky notes there, and I didn't have time to take them all off. So this is saying assumed you.
Assume you, okay. As long as you depend on something special, something it is assumed you should depend on, you are not strong enough to go on by yourself. You cannot find your way. So first of all, know yourself and be strong enough to live without any sign, without any information. That is the most important point. There is truth, you say, but there can be various truths. The question is not which way you should go. If you only try to go in one direction, or if you always depend on signs, you will not find your own way. The best thing is to have eyes to read various signs. I had this kind of experience when I was in Manchuria.
Great, thanks, Teresa. Okay. So any last comments on that section, or any closing comments before we close for tonight?
Very good book.
I know. I mean, if you get a chance, read the whole book because it's amazing.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
What time are we going to start next week? Same time?
Yeah, same time.
Okay.